Hi there, Why Religion friends. Professor Anthony Sweat here from BYU's Department of Church History and Doctrine. Welcome to another great episode of the Why Religion podcast. In my position as a professor of Church History and Doctrine, I often have the blessing to teach Doctrine and Covenants, Section 84, one of the great sections on the priesthood. In fact, Joseph Smith's history designates Section 84 as precisely that, a, quote, revelation on priesthood, end of quote. If we aren't careful when we study that section, we can misunderstand that Doctrine and Covenants 84 is a revelation on priesthood oaths and covenants, not a revelation on priesthood offices and assignments. In context, Section 84 is a temple revelation about the relationship of the temple, the priesthood, and the endowment of power. Thus, the promises of God's oath and covenant that is mentioned in Doctrine and Covenants Section 84, verses 33 to 40, about becoming the seed of Abraham and the elect of God and receiving Jesus and all that the Father has, apply to all of those who receive the blessings of the temple, men and women. Years ago, I was teaching this very important concept to a group of BYU students, and one of the students raised his hand and asked in a skeptical voice something like this: "Has the prophet ever taught anything like that? That this oath and covenant applies to women as well as men?" At the time, I didn't think that they had, at least not explicitly that I was aware of, and that's how I answered the student. You can imagine my delight when, a few years later, I came across a video that the church released with President Russell M. Nelson, where he had an interview with Gene B. Brigham, the General Relief Society president of the church at that time, about women and priesthood, and the subject of the oath and covenant of the priesthood found in Section 84 came up.
So it's clearly a two-way covenant. He makes the provision and you accept them and keep those covenants and get the blessings.
So that is just as relevant to women as it is to men, because
Totally.
all those priesthood blessings from the oath and covenant of priesthood are enjoyed by both men and women.
Exactly.
Professor Barbara Morgan Gardner of BYU's Department of Church History and Doctrine has done significantly important work over the last few years on the subject of Latter-day Saint women and priesthood, and she recently published an article called "Using Section 84 to Emphasize the Priesthood Power of Women," where she writes about these concepts and others being emphasized by modern prophets.
That's why in this article is extremely quote heavy, because for a woman BYU professor talking about women in the priesthood, I could be edgy, but I'm not here to be edgy. I'm here to follow the prophet, and I'm here to teach students about what the prophet is wanting them to do.
In this episode, Professor Gardner shares her research on Doctrine and Covenants 84 about the oath and covenant of the priesthood and its relationship to women, the temple, and the family, and why its teachings, covenants, and blessings apply to us all. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Casey Griffiths interviewed his Church History and Doctrine colleague Barbara Morgan Gardner about her article "Using Section 84 to Emphasize the Priesthood Power of Women," published in The Religious Educator. In Part 1, Dr. Morgan Gardner talks about discussing the subject of women and the priesthood, and also the temple, and what church leaders have said about women and the priesthood, along with the concept of priesthood in the ecclesiastical church and the temple and family. So here is Casey Griffiths interviewing Barbara Morgan Gardner.
Hi, this is Casey Griffiths. I'm here with Barbara Morgan Gardner, my dear friend.
Hello, dear Casey.
Hello, how are you, Barb?
Great.
And we are talking about your article, Barbara, using Section 84 to emphasize the priesthood power of women. This can be found in the Religious Educator, Volume 22. Number 2 was published in 2021. And it's a great article. We were talking beforehand about Section 84 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And my experience with Section 84 outside of teaching it has been that before a young man gains the Melchizedek priesthood, you sit down with them, if you're their ecclesiastical leader, and you read through the oath and covenant of the priesthood, which is contained in Section 84. And I have done that on numerous occasions. I'm getting ready to do it with my own son, who's turning 18 in a couple weeks here. But I hadn't thought, we need to do this with young women too, because I felt some pangs of guilt. I have a 20-year-old daughter, and she's wonderful.
No, just kidding. Don't feel guilty.
No. She's wonderful, but I never thought I need to sit down with her and read through the oath and covenant of the priesthood. So explain to us a little bit about what led to this article and how it's impacted you.
I used to have, back in the day when I taught seminary, I'd have all the young men memorize the oath and covenant of the priesthood. And then Sister Beck talked to the women of the church at a BYU women's conference and invited all the women of the church to memorize the oath and covenant of the priesthood. And I remember thinking, why in the world would she have the women do that? That was an impetus for me to memorize it myself. And then I went into did an initiatory in the temple, and I thought, oh my goodness, the oath and covenant of the priesthood has everything to do with women, as it does to men, because the oath and covenant of the priesthood takes place and the oath and covenants are happening in the temple. And so from then on, I started having an assignment here at BYU that all of my students, if they wanted extra credit, they memorized the oath and covenant of the priesthood, and then they talked to me about how it applied to them. So I would do personal interviews. And at first, every young woman would tell me, well, it has to do with me because my brother's going on a mission. I want to be supportive of him. Or my dad is a priesthood holder and he gives blessings. And so it's important that and it was all about the men in their lives. And it wasn't until another year later that I'd been teaching the oath and covenant of the priesthood in reference to the priesthood and temple and women, that women started applying it to themselves, and it was like lights turned on everywhere. So I personally believe that it's absolutely critical, as President Nelson talks about, that women understand that the oath and covenant priesthood refers to them as well. When we talk about priesthood and women, we're typically talking about the hierarchical public structure of the church. And even with interviews that I've done with General Relief Society presidents over the years, and I've done many now, it wasn't really until Sister Beck, we're talking, 2014, 2015, where you start hearing the women discuss the temple. Even Elaine Jack, I interviewed her recently, and she said that's just not something we talked about. That wasn't an emphasis of the late 90s, and we just didn't have that conversation, and we didn't invite the women of the church to be talking openly about the temple and teaching their children about the temple. There's a great talk from President Benson where he asked the women of the church, and he asked all members of the church that were there at this meeting at the Logan Tabernacle, to talk to their grandchildren openly about the temple. But again, he spoke in the temple, asking people to speak to their grandchildren about the temple. So the public talks that we hear are typically, regarding priesthood, are typically male leaders of the church talking to those who hold the priesthood or priesthood offices, which is the young men and then older men, Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood holders. And so it's a typical conversation from a priesthood holder to a priesthood holder talking about the ecclesiastical or administrative structure of the church. Mm-hmm. And so it's not common to hear the conversation dealing with women and the temple because it's so private and it's sacred. Mm-hmm. In the last few years, though, we have talks by President Benson, by President Nelson and Elder Bednar and President Eyring and President Ballard. We could go on and on. The senior apostles and First Presidency have all in the last, 10 years have spoken openly about the temple, have talked to us about what we can and can't talk about, and have been pleading with us to understand more as women and men in the church. Yeah,
and I want to quote, actually, you mentioned Elder Bednar. He gave a talk where he kind of said, this is what you should talk about.
The guidelines are there.
And this is what, so he said this, temple preparation is most effective in our homes.
Amen.
But many church members are unsure about what appropriately can and cannot be said regarding the temple experience outside the temple. So here's the guidelines he gave.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Guideline 1, because we love the Lord, we should always speak about his holy house with reverence. We should not disclose or describe the special symbols associated with the covenants we receive in sacred temple ceremonies. Neither should we discuss the holy information we specifically promise in the temple not to reveal. Guideline 2, the temple is the house of the Lord. Everything in the temple points us to our Savior, Jesus Christ. We may discuss the basic purposes and the doctrine and principles associated with temple ordinances and covenants. So if that sets the table, there's a lot about the temple that we can discuss.
Again, I couldn't agree more. I had a niece that came into my office just yesterday, and she is preparing to go to the temple this next weekend. And she just said, before I go to the temple, is there anything I should know? And of course, I just kind of laugh. Like, where do you want to start? And we've talked about the temple a number of times over the years, but we really talked about, let's talk about temple clothing first. Let's look on the internet and let's see what the church's website, official website, teaches you about the temple garment and the garments of the holy priesthood. And let's look at these pictures and let's help you understand what that's going to look like. And let's talk about the covenants that you're going to be making, so that when you're in the temple and you're making those covenants, it's not just blowing your mind and you're wondering and hoping that you're going to keep those covenants. You already know what those covenants are before you go in. Let's talk about the temple questions that President Nelson has spoken of publicly in General Conference. And so we really went through together and we talked about what she could be expecting from the moment she walks into the temple to the moment she leaves the temple, and how to prepare herself for the future. I have found that many young adults, especially the younger young adults, are nervous. Those who are nervous about going to the temple are nervous because they haven't been able to have an open conversation with someone. Mm-hmm. And I've also noticed, and this is common on any topic, but temple is such a sacred topic, that many don't talk about the temple because they don't know what they can and can't talk about, which therefore makes it a nervous conversation, or there's no conversation at all, and they'll just say it's too sacred to talk about. Well, then we have students and we have young adults that are struggling with going to the temple at all because they're nervous or they're anxious. And so as adults, as mentors, as leaders, as parents, the more we understand, such as that quote that you just gave from Elder Bednar, the more we understand about what we can and can't talk about in the temple, and the more we understand the doctrines and principles associated with the temple and the actual procedures and things, then the more comfortable those who are going in, the younger generation, will be.
So where do you start? You have a young woman getting ready to go on a mission, or that's come home from a mission, and you want to do Women in the Priesthood 101. Where's the best starting point here?
It depends on the young woman, of course. So with my niece, for example, this conversation we just had, just a few months ago, she was asking me questions about the priesthood. She's not served a mission. She's 18 years old. And I don't know if she will or will not serve a mission. But we just started just talking about basic things as family members. And she was just asking, is it okay if I ask questions about the priesthood? And of course, I just laughed and said, the prophet wants us. The prophet has pled with us. And I go to the 2019 General Conference talk where President Nelson is talking to the women of the church, and he says the priesthood is just as relevant to women as it is to men. And then he pleads with the sisters to study Section 25, Section 84, Section 107, the Doctrine and Covenants, to understand the doctrines associated with it, and then to go to the temple and to be in personal prayer and live righteously so that they can better understand the priesthood, the doctrines, and then use the priesthood power that they have so that they can bless other people. So one big area that I go to, especially with these young adults, is in the days of your parents or in the days past, traditionally, as you said, it seems like women and talking about women in priesthood was a little bit taboo. But today, we have a prophet who was pleading with the women of the church to better understand the priesthood and how they are associated with the priesthood, this power and authority of God. And then we talk about what the priesthood is. So, back in the day, even in the last handbook, General Handbook, they have changed the actual use of priesthood and how it's being described. In the past, it would always say that the priesthood is the power and authority of God given to man upon the earth. Now they actually specifically say, and I wish I could find the actual, here it is. They actually say, God grants authority and power to his sons and daughters on earth to help carry out this work. So it could have been before, man could have been gender unspecific. It could have been either men or women using that terminology. But today it is very clear that both women and men are supposed to be using or could be using the priesthood power of God and the authority of God in order to be about his work, which is saving of souls. So besides just trying to give her some, I want them to understand the invitation from a prophet today and the leaders of the church today. And then let's just talk about basically what the priesthood is, because if we only think about it in context of a man, then you're right, it's a little bit hard for a woman to understand it. But these definitions and this help from the leaders of the church have been beneficial, no question.
Yeah, and in that spirit, if there's anybody out there that's wondering if it's okay to discuss this, you start your article with, I think, about 15 different talks given by leaders of the church where they address this specifically. And so one advantage of your article is right at the first. Here's a really robust reading list where this topic is discussed, and you could kind of see how the leaders of the church have been urging us in this direction for some time to have more conversations about this.
Yeah, and that's critical to me here. It's critical in any writing that I do that seems to be especially on the line where people have a little bit of a nervous twitch about studying a topic. And that's why in this article is extremely quote heavy, because for a woman BYU professor talking about women in the priesthood, I could be edgy, but I'm not here to be edgy. I'm here to follow the prophet, and I'm here to teach students about what the prophet is wanting them to do. And so I intentionally and carefully made sure that although I'm agreeing with the prophets, I'm using the prophet's voice. I could have just summarized the prophets and put it into my own words. I intentionally didn't do that because I know that many who are trying to be covenant, obedient, strong, active, solid members of the church want it from the words of the prophet, the first presidency, Quorum of the 12. And so in this, I talk about the importance of triangulating and making sure that we're using all of these talks from the prophet.
And one thing that struck me was we can't even say this is a new development in the church. As I read through the article, two of the most quoted authorities here are Ezra Taft Benson and Bruce R. McConkie.
And I intentionally did that. So I intentionally tried to get the two most senior First Presidency members in their talks, those who are considered the most doctrinally sound in the past. So Elder McConkie obviously was one of those. And then I tried to also hit Joseph Smith. And I wanted to have some of the Joseph Smith quotes because Joseph Smith, we actually did a study recently with one of my students where we looked at the terms of endowment and power and those associated with women. Mm-hmm. And we see that the numbers are basically Joseph Smith and President Nelson. They take the top on both of those. So to me, they're kind of these bookends, even for now, of we have the prophet in the early days and the prophet today, and for whatever reason, that emphasis on women and priesthood power and authority becomes critical for both of them.
So let's dive into what they actually did say.
Yeah.
A lot of times when this comes up, a friendly introductory quote is from Dallin H. Oaks, his April 2014 address, The Keys and Authority of the Priesthood. And I remember listening to this and the bells going off in my head, but this is the way he introduces it. We are not accustomed to speaking of women having the authority of the priesthood in their church callings, but what other authority can it be? When a woman, young or old, is set apart to preach the gospel as a full-time missionary, she's given priesthood authority to perform a priesthood function. The same is true when a woman is set apart to function as an officer or teacher in a church organization under the direction of one who holds the keys of the priesthood. Whoever functions in an office or calling received from one who holds priesthood keys exercises priesthood authority in performing her or his assigned duties.
That was a monumental talk, no question, for many people to understand. President Oaks is quoting Joseph F. Smith, who gives us kind of a similar quote years previously, but he's adding to it. I love it where he says in that quote, what other authority would it be? And the reality is, I think that those who have thought about this have answered that question, but perhaps not said it quite so carefully. And again, it was a member of the First Presidency. Well, at that time, he was a member of the Quorum of the 12 speaking. Mm-hmm. But the question is, yes, what other authority would it be? And the reality is none other than the priesthood. And so for a woman, it's nice to be able to hear that because it's, okay, I've always felt this. I've always known I've had authority. As a missionary, I always knew I had authority to preach the gospel, but I didn't know by what authority it was, except that I knew that it was coming from God. And then you take yourself to, well, this is God's power and authority, so I must have his powers and authority, but I'm not really supposed to call it priesthood, but then what do I call it? Mm-hmm. And the only answer is priesthood, because that is God's power and authority. So President Oaks actually gives us terminology and kind of, in a sense, permission to be able to say what we have known. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense. So yes, and that's a great quote, but also to understand that that's in context again of the ecclesiastical priesthood. That's where there's some confusion. Mm-hmm. And so you look at May 1829, you have John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John coming and restoring the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood. to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, that's what we're talking about. That's the priesthood keys. That's the priesthood authority. That's the power that's coming from that experience in 1829. That's the ecclesiastical hierarchical structure of the church that gives women priesthood power and authority through their callings. That's not the order of the priesthood, the patriarchal order of the priesthood, that gives women priesthood power through the temple covenants. And so that's an important distinction.
You mentioned this in your article, that there's maybe two ways of organizing things that you think about. There's ecclesiastical hierarchy, which is the system we're familiar with, but it's clear from the scriptures that there wasn't always a church that things were organized around. In fact, walk us through this a little bit. There's two ways of organizing, basically. So tell us a little bit about that.
So Section 84 is really great with this, and this is where it opens the door. You can see Joseph Smith in those early sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. I mean, in Section 2, he's being told that Elijah is going to come and reveal to him this ability for the hearts to turn to their fathers and the fathers to their children, the sealing authority, right? This priesthood. And so we know that he's supposed to receive this priesthood, but Elijah doesn't come until the Kirtland Temple at this point, a decade and a half later. Mm-hmm. And so we know that Joseph Smith, whether or not he wrote about it, we know that he hasn't seen Elijah and he hasn't received these keys, but he does receive those keys from Peter, James, and John. So we know that there's a distinction and there's an ecclesiastical structure of the church we talked about, which Joseph Smith was building. I mean, he starts calling, you see in Section 18 of the Doctrine and Covenants, this call to call the Quorum of the 12. And we see these other callings as he's going along to build the church. He had that authority because he received it in May of 1829. But he did not have the authority to build a temple. He didn't have the authority not build, but to give the keys of the temple. He hadn't received those keys. He hadn't received the authority of the gathering of Israel and of the sealing and those that he received in the Kirtland Temple. Even all the men of the church, regardless of who they were and what calling they had, including those who were going to be called as members of the Quorum of the 12 and even the First Presidency, did not have these keys. Mm-hmm. Patriarchal order of the priesthood was what our heavenly parents would have used in their premortal life, is what was given to Adam and Eve as they entered into the patriarchal order of the priesthood. And then you see in Section 84 of the Doctrine and Covenants, where the Lord reveals through Joseph Smith, that's going to go from Adam all the way down and through Moses. So it's not just Adam, of course, you put the wives in there. So Adam and Eve enter into the patriarchal order of the priesthood. Sarah and Abraham are going to enter into the patriarchal order of the priesthood. And that goes all the way through until Moses. And so this order of the priesthood, this patriarchal order of the priesthood, is very Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And then it stops again, of course, in the time of Moses, because Moses tries, as it says in Doctrine and Covenants, Section 84, he tries to give this priesthood to his people, but they refuse to do so. They were not able to enter into the rest of the Father. And so they fall away. And this order of the priesthood, the patriarchal priesthood, is taken away at that time. Patriarchal order, another term that President Benson uses, is familial order. Mm-hmm. So he says it could be otherwise known as the order of family government, where a man and a woman enter into this order of the priesthood together. And so the temple is family. That's why you don't have, the only order, like the only hierarchical in a sense would be the temple president. But there's also a matron. Mm-hmm. And so they're working together symbolically as a family, where you have the head of the temple, and then you have those who are going to be eventually entering into this order where they're going to be sealed across the altar, and they are going to receive kingdoms and principalities and all that's associated. It's talked about in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's not patriarchy. This is not a man being over a woman. That is, I hope it's long gone that we believe that is the case. That's a critical point. I can't imagine Heavenly Father telling Heavenly Mother what to do and giving her permission. I just don't see that kind of relationship in the eternities. I don't think it exists like that. I think it's two people mm-hmm. who care dearly about each other, who both of them have their work and their glory is to bring to pass the eternal life of their children, and they want to have an eternal family. And so they have this family, and that's the order that existed there. That's the order that's going to continue to exist. In fact, I find it fascinating in the Old Testament, studying in Come Follow Me, where you look at those who are in the patriarchal order. Adam and Eve had a great relationship. And you look at, in Moses, they worked together as a couple. Abraham and Sarah worked together as a couple. You look at the Abrahamic covenant. Elder McConkie has a great quote that I put in this article where it says there's every promise that's for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob belongs to Sarah, Rachel, and Rebekah. Mm-hmm. You can't have one without the other. They go hand in hand. So the patriarchal order is the great equalizer. The patriarchal order allows for two people to make covenants with God, and because they're making and keeping their covenants with God, they are becoming like them. That's the equalizer. So nothing is as equalizing as the patriarchal order and unifying, or nothing is as unifying and equalizing as the patriarchal order of the priesthood.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place to check out. The RSC has recently published a new book called They Shall Grow Together, the Bible in the Book of Mormon, edited by Charles Swift and Nicholas Frederick, who are both professors of ancient scripture here at BYU. This fourth volume, published by the Book of Mormon Academy at Brigham Young University, is a careful study of the intersections of two ancient texts, the Book of Mormon and the Bible. The authors approach the two books of Scripture from within two fundamental frameworks. First, several of the essays explore the books in terms of the worlds from which they come, with their related ideals, interests, and origins. Second, a number of the authors analyze topics based on the texts themselves, closely studying the two texts and helping readers better understand connections between them. As we remember that one of the reasons for the Book of Mormon is to confirm the truthfulness of the Bible, this book is an excellent resource to see the connections between these two witnesses of Jesus Christ. Again, the book is called They Shall Grow Together, the Bible in the Book of Mormon. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Dr. Barbara Morgan Gardner discuss her recent article on Doctrine and Covenants 84 and the priesthood power of women. In part 2 of Why Religion, we'd like to explore a little bit more about why this research matters. How can it inform us in helping us to better live, learn, or love aspects of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ? So in this part, Professor Gardner will discuss ideas related to priesthood and the family, including the idea of presiding and a husband and wife as co-equals in the family, along with how the blessings in D&C 84's Oath and Covenant of the Priesthood apply to us all.
And I noticed you bringing up Adam and Eve. On my most recent reading of the Doctrine and Covenants, their last appearance in canon is in section 138, and they're there together. Yeah. They're at the head of this vast multitude that greets Christ when he comes into it, acting as presiding officers.
And glorious Mother Eve, acting as a presiding officer with Adam.
Over the women that are there who are acting in concert with their husbands as well. Yeah. So it's probably not, it's misleading to say something like, well, the wife is the first counselor or she's the vice president, because it's not a presiding officer-counselor relationship. It's unlike anything in the ecclesiastical hierarchy in that there's two co-presiding officers that are co-equal in authority, acting as the heads of a family organization.
You don't see any hierarchical man over a woman in the temple at all, period. It doesn't exist. And therefore, we're taught over and over again that what you learn in the temple, you take home to your family. It's not, the church shouldn't be overlaid with the family. It's the temple and the family that go hand in hand together. The church and the hierarchical and ecclesiastical priesthood, if I were to draw two circles, they would overlap. And President Oakes talks about this in his 2020 talk. We need each other. But Elder Ballard talks about how eventually the church structure is like scaffolding to a building, and eventually it's going to fade away. And what stands in the next life is the husband and the wife together ruling in their families, just like you're talking about with Adam and Eve. So a man and a woman, a man's not kneeling higher than a woman in the ceiling. They're symbolically kneeling across the altar as equals. President Hinckley quoted Elder Perry, has a great quote where he says, the structure of this is just me summarizing, but he says the structure of the churches and other places is that there is a patriarch or a president and a vice president. And he says in a family, there is no vice president. They are together parents in a home, or if they're not parents, they're together as husband and wife, but there's not one above another. They walk side by side.
I remember a story Calfred Broderick told. He's this Latter-day Saint marriage and family therapist. He said Boyd K. Packer, who we all think is kind of conservative, old school, came to him, set him apart as a stake president, and then said, "No, President, I don't want you treating your wife the way you treat the stake." And Calfred Broderick said, "I wasn't planning on mistreating either of them, but what do you mean?" And President Packer said, "You need to treat them differently." He said, "In the stake, when you make a decision, everybody will rally around you and support you. But if you ever treat your wife that way, you will have failed in your leadership. Yep. You don't treat her as subordinate to you. She is co-equal with you, and you both need to make the decision together." And that's one big difference, is that I think it's fair to say that the church, like you said, is a temporary structure, maybe because our families aren't in order here, where a young women's president husband can provide the kind of surrogate older sister that a young woman needs. Or a bishop who's acting as a young men's president can maybe fill the role that an absent father could. But if everything was firing on all cylinders, we might not need the church because our families would be where our needs are met. That might have been illustrated during the pandemic when we had to shut down the church. But we never shut down the family. We just can't. It's essential to our survival.
Well, and that's President Nelson talking about how we need family-centered, church-supported. I mean, they're definitely trying to get us there. To your point, Elder McConkie, back to talking about that, he actually says that the reason why we had to have the ecclesiastical structure of the church was because the time that Christ came was no longer family structured and family oriented. And so Christ had to build an ecclesiastical hierarchical type structure at the time. So it would fit the society. But the ideal structure would have been the family structure. It would have stayed what even Adam had together. It would have stayed with Sarah and Abraham, or Abraham and Sarah, however you want to say that. So the family structure is the ideal structure. And we don't live that perfect society today. We don't live the Zion that we all desire, but that's critical. I just want to share maybe a couple of, I get asked this question all the time about presiding, because I do think it's important, and you're mentioning it in terms of a man being over a woman and things like that. You look in the section of the Doctrine and Covenants, and you could put in, like we talked about before, these women's names in there. So just maybe two personal examples. When I was dating my now husband, Dustin, I remember having a discussion with him. I think it was like our first date. Maybe it was our second date. But it was, we were both older and it was pretty intense. And I just asked him immediately, like, what do you think about your wife working outside of the home? Mm-hmm. And he, without even skipping a beat, he just said, I would assume that the woman I marry is wise enough and close enough with the Lord and is able to receive revelation that between the two of us, we'd be able to figure that out with each other. And I just thought, now that's a good answer. Like, he understands that as a husband and wife, we would work together in conjunction with the Lord, as the prophets have taught today, and we'd be able to receive personal revelation for our lives according to what is best for our eternal family. And another one was preside, and it's just an example that I think about with my own parents, but I'm grateful for. When my mom was passing away from cancer, she had brain cancer, and when she was close to death, I was constantly the one kind of in charge of giving her the medication and things, and it was serious medication, and it was a constant. It was every couple of hours that I was in her bedroom trying to help her as I was running back and forth from work and making sure she was correctly medicated. Mm-hmm. But right before, just a couple of weeks before she passed away, I tried to give her medication, and typically I would put it on her tongue, and she just looked at me and she said, Barb, why are you trying to poison me? I mean, obviously she had brain cancer, so she's not in her right state of mind. She would never have said that in a normal situation. Sure. But it was pretty painful for her to think that I was actually, I can laugh about it now, but at the time it wasn't funny. But I just said, I would explain to her, Mom, I'm not poisoning you. And I just gave her every reason under the sun that she needed to take this medication. I couldn't convince her to take it. And then finally she just said to me, if my husband will give it to me, then I will take it. Wow. So I went and got my dad, brought him in there. He was in a wheelchair. He was really struggling himself at the time at the loss of knowing that he was losing my mom. And he just said, Sharon, it would be best for you to take this medication. And my mom just said, Al, I think that people are trying to kill me. And he just said, Sharon, I understand that. It must be very difficult for you, but you need to take this medication. It helps you to not have so much pain. And then she just said, if that's what you desire, then I will do it. And I remember my dad taking that little pill, putting it on her tongue, squeezing some water into her mouth, because I think it was grape juice, into her mouth, and just moving on. And that, to me, is what presiding is. My mom would have done it would have been the exact opposite if they would have flipped it. That right. is, a husband puts his wife first. A wife puts his husband first. They trust each other. They would do anything for their eternal family and for each other. It's not a competition. Presiding isn't a competition. It's service. It's meekness. It's love. It's all that's associated with it. So, a righteous man and woman who are covenant making, covenant keeping, there's not going to be a competition. Yeah.
And it feels like that idea that one rules over the other is a false dichotomy.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
It's always been the twain are one.
Right.
They act as one individual. And that could mean a lot of ebbs and flows as to who does what and who has what authority is in mind.
Absolutely. And I think that again, that's why it's important, why we understand that Section 84 of the Doctrine and Covenants is a temple section, especially those first, because we know it's 3 different revelations, but that first part of the revelations that I talk about in this paper, that's where it's critical that we understand this is a temple context. There's not a competition going on here. There aren't specific assignments and specific roles given to men and women here. It's a temple revelation where both are making and keeping sacred covenants that allow them to see the face of God and enter into his presence.
Yeah, just to emphasize that, you included in your article a conversation between Sister Bingham and President Nilsson. President Nilsson said, "The oath and covenant of the priesthood means that God's made a promise and he sets the conditions, and if you agree to keep them, you make a covenant." And then he also indicates, when you do what I say, you will receive the blessings, but if you do not do what I say, you have no promise. So it's clearly a two-way conversation, a covenant two-way. He makes the provision, and you accept them and keep those covenants and keep the blessings. And then Sister Bingham said, "So is that just as relevant to women as it is to men?" President Nilsson's answer, "Totally."
Yep.
Then Sister Bingham says, "All those priesthood blessings from the oath and covenant of the priest are enjoyed by both men and women." President Nilsson, exactly.
You look at that conversation between Sister Bingham and President Nelson, and you're seeing it now in context of especially the temple and the initiatory and what women and men are both doing. And then you start thinking about, okay, what does it mean to obtain? You're starting in verse 33. And then verse 34, they become the sons of Moses and of Aaron and the seed of Abraham. Where does that happen outside of the temple? It doesn't. That's a temple reference. And the church and kingdom of the elect of God, where do you become the elect of God? That's the temple. And also they who receive this priesthood in the temple, both women and men are receiving. It doesn't say they are ordained. It says that they are receiving the priesthood. And you continue on. They receive and they receive. And then 38, and he that receiveth my Father receiveth my Father's kingdom. Therefore all that my Father hath shall be given unto him. I can't emphasize enough how critical that is for the women of the church to understand that this has to do with women, because otherwise only the men get all that the Father has. But what do the women get? Whatever's left. I mean, it sounds so silly that we even think that way, but in our culture today, that's very demeaning to women unless women understand that they do receive all that the Father has as well. A man cannot receive all that the Father has without a wife. And a wife can't receive all that Father has without a husband. This is meant for a couple. You cannot enter into the oath and covenant of the priesthood the way it is associated with in the temple unless you are married. And so that requires both together to be able to make and keep these covenants. Otherwise, there is no promise of the seed of Abraham. It doesn't exist without Sarah. Abraham cannot receive these blessings unless he has a wife who is a covenant-making and keeping person. So it's critical that we understand that and teach that in context of women.
Well said.
Thank you.
Again, my favorite quote from this article came from President Nilsson as he was talking to single women. He said, "If you are endowed, but not currently married to a man who bears the priesthood, and someone says to you, 'I'm sorry you don't have the priesthood in your home,' please understand that statement is incorrect." And I wanted to,
Yes.
I pumped my fist in the air like,
Yes.
I can't wait to share this with my students.
Yeah.
He said, "You might not have a priesthood bearer in your home, but you have received and made sacred covenants with God in his temple. From those covenants flows an endowment of his priesthood power upon you." So a lot of these blessings do come through the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, but there's power that's administered through going to the temple or through a woman receiving an ecclesiastical calling. There's authority that comes when a woman is given a role within the church, because there's no other kind of authority in the church than priesthood authority.
Right. Again, not being married until I was 40, this becomes critical to me. And it was always critical. I knew, because again, I had good men in my life who also understood this. I remember my father visiting my home, which was across the street for a number of years when I was a BYU professor, and my parents lived across the street. And I remember having family activities and family gatherings at my house, and I remember saying to my dad, "Who would you like to pray for the dinner?" And he would say, without fail, "Barb, it's your house. You preside here. Like, why would you be asking me? This is your home. You have made covenants with God. You have the priesthood power and authority that is necessary for you to be running your own home. I appreciate that you're respecting me as a father by asking that question, but really it's a lack of understanding. I mean, and he would teach that very clearly to me. So it didn't take long for me to realize when I had my own home and I was the woman there presiding, that I called on someone to pray, and it was my authority, and according to my righteousness and my covenant-keeping nature, I hope that I had power based upon that in my own home. When you're home alone as a single woman, Of course you want to be married. Of course, I shouldn't say of course. Most would like to be married. Many would like to be married. Many would like to have a husband in the home and who's available to give priesthood blessings, as my husband now is. And I'm so beyond grateful to be in a relationship where I have a worthy husband. But I had priesthood power and authority in my home regardless of my marital status because of the covenants that I had made in the temple. That's the beauty of the endowment. The endowment, making and keeping sacred covenants in the temple, is what gives women priesthood power and authority in the home. It's not what they do in the church. Being called as a Relief Society president of the church does not give me priesthood power and authority in my home. It gives me priesthood power and authority in my calling. But I don't bring that home. Neither does a man. The man doesn't bring the priesthood power and authority to his home because he was called as a bishop. He brings that priesthood power and authority to his home on two bases. One, because he is ordained to an office that allows him to perform a priesthood function, which is a blessing of the family. But even then, if he doesn't go to the temple and receive his covenants, he doesn't have the authority associated with his covenants. So he's lacking in authority and lacking in power unless he receives his covenants too.
If you're interested in reading Professor Barbara Morgan Gardner's article, Using Section 84 to Emphasize the Priesthood Power of Women, we've provided a link to it on our website at yreligion.byu.edu. That's the letter Y, religion.byu.edu. There, we've also given you a link to learn more about Professor Gardner and her other research publications, as well as links to past Why Religion episodes and professors with their publications. Dr. Gardner has been on the podcast before, so if you've enjoyed her perspectives in this episode, I'd highly recommend you listen to her excellent Why Religion episode. It's episode number 2, simply called Women and Priesthood. It's one of our top downloaded episodes of all time. All right, we've arrived at our last segment of Why Religion, Part 3, where we like to discuss things a little bit more personal with the professor. Since Professor Gardner has been on the podcast, as I mentioned, here she shares how her life and her perspective has adjusted since being married and having children, and what she has learned in balancing her various life responsibilities as she builds and maintains her own eternal marriage and family.
You've already noted some major changes in your life, including you got married a few years ago. It feels like we go on trips together.
I know. Casey and I, we're tight.
We were in Washington, D.C. when you told me you were getting married.
Oh, that's right.
And then
Casey.
A couple years ago, you
Casey,
and I
think you were like the only one who knew at that time. I'm pretty sure I bursted it out to you.
I was super thrilled. Then a few years ago, you and I were in Hawaii, and your husband, Dustin, was there. And we were eating lunch, and you told me that you and Dustin were going to become parents.
That's true.
And so since you've appeared on Why Religion, there's been a big change in your life, which is that you're a mother now.
I am. But I will say I've always been a mother, as Eve was a mother before she had children. Right. But in context and semantics, yes, I now have children, and I am a mother of 2 daughters who are living in our home. Lest we think that any person who is single is not a mother in this context.
Well put.
I do have children in my home.
And I'm glad to be. Since the last part of our conversations are usually a little bit more personal, tell us a little bit about how that's maybe changed your perspective, how this next part of your life where you have 2 little people that live in your house that you're responsible for has changed your perspective on all the things that you write and teach about.
It's made a huge impact. In fact, I used to have this book in my head that I would think about often, mostly in the shower, I think, but it was what I would if I could. And the thought was really what I would teach my daughters if I could have them, with the thought that I never would. I got into a point where I thought that I was too old to have my own children. And so if I could write a book for other people's children, or if I could write a book for my future children, what would it be? And the idea of temple and priesthood and motherhood and family has always been top on the list. And in the past, I've always done it with my students in mind or with my nephews and nieces. But now when I write and think and talk, I think of my daughters, and it's a lot of pressure. I want to get it right. I don't want them to be confused. I want them to know that when they leave for college, when they get older, that they have priesthood power and authority through their covenants. I want them to know right now that they've been sealed in the temple and that we are an eternal family, and that they were born as if they are living as if they were born in this covenant. And when they are baptized, Allie was just baptized this last year, that she is starting that path, that covenant path with God. They've already started the path because of the Abrahamic covenant, but they're continuing on that path. And as Allie gets a calling, even if it's just simply to drop off flyers at the neighbor's house, she has authority to do so. And she can put that piece of paper on that doorstep with the authority that she needs, and that she can be protected with that authority as well. I want them to understand their relationships with men and with the world, and understand so in a very positive and real manner. On the other side, it is very different to have two little children in the home while I'm, preparing lessons and trying to be a full-time professor and a wife and have the other responsibilities. So learning that balance has become extremely critical and difficult at times, frankly. But one of the things I've learned, or maybe a couple of things. One, stay very close to the Lord and seek constant revelation to know that I'm on the right path. There have been times when I have felt, Barb, you are spending a little bit too much time on the road or a little bit too much time away. And I get reminded quickly to come home and make sure that we're cuddling and reading and playing games and running outside together. But on the other side, there have been times when I have felt very strongly, Barb, your girls are okay. They're at school right now, and you really need to focus on those students. You have a couple of students that really need your help, and you can really help them and guide them in this process. And then also, of course, relationship with my husband and things. It's a balancing act. It's really important. So one is that constant revelation from the Lord is critical. And then I think the second thing is, which is very hard to do as a woman. I don't know if it's hard for a man or not, but it's be where you are. Mm-hmm. So when I'm at work, I try to focus on work. And of course, if I get a phone call from my 6-year-old who seems to call often from school, then I will answer her phone call, make sure she's okay. But to be careful to use the time that I have to fulfill the measure of my creation. And that's an individual decision. But in my case, I'm extremely confident that that's what the Lord wants me to do. And so I'm very comfortable doing it. But to be balanced in doing so. And also, in my case, with my husband, to be very close with him, make sure we have a constant and honest communication. I recognize that he is the father in our home and that he has opinions and solid thoughts and comments, and that together we're meant to raise the family, and it's not just me and it's not just him. So working very tightly and very closely together as a couple to make sure that we're doing this correctly.
And I've got to say, your husband is wonderful.
He's the bomb. He's the best.
He beams when he looks at you, basically.
Oh, Casey.
He is so supportive, and I don't know if you could do as much as you do if it wasn't for your husband and how incredibly supportive he is of you and what you do. And we were at dinner the other night together, my wife and your husband and all four of us. And I remember you doing that in turn. I brought up something like, oh, well, maybe he can take off and work from home and support you. And you jumped in and said, no, his career is important too.
It is.
I've got to be sensitive to all the stuff that he does as well. So you two are just a good model.
Well, thank you, Casey. Far from perfect, but we do adore each other, and most importantly, we love the Lord, and we want an eternal family, and I'm grateful for a husband that gets it. Yeah, he is. It was well worth the wait, to say the least. Yeah,
I think so, and he would probably say the same.
And
thing
likewise
too.
With you too. I mean, I just love being with you and your wife, and just the fun stories and experiences together. Marriage is hard. I mean, it takes a long time to get married, but sometimes, I teach this eternal family class, and you do as well, Casey. And sometimes I think these students think you just jump into a marriage and everything is bliss. But I love one of the things from the Insights book on President Nelson is he talks about some of those struggles, even that he and Wendy had when they first started getting married, and just recognize it's okay to disagree. In fact, it's fantastic to disagree. But it's learning how to do that with each other. And frankly, that's part of what the temple teaches, and that's part of even the sealing covenant that we're making today as we're instructed on how to treat each other and how to be with each other.
Feels like in our society, the movie ends when the couple gets married. Yeah. But the temple teaches that that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning of the real story. Yeah. That's where you really start to learn what it means to be like God and what it means to really love someone and take care of them and unselfishly want the best for them.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and back to that single part. Sometimes I'm careful with this. There have been times when people have said something as if something like, "When you have children, you really learn how to love." I'm pretty sure I learned how to love before I had children. I have nephews and nieces that I loved dearly, and I still love dearly. It didn't take having children to love. I think and maybe it's different from men. Again, I don't know. I'm not a man, but as women, we are nurturers. and every woman nurtures differently. But I love my daughters differently than perhaps I loved my nieces and nephews. Love my nieces and nephews. They're not in my home. I'm not as responsible for them. But my heart is theirs too. As a single member of the church, I wet my pillow at night for them too, and I fasted and prayed for them too, and my students as well, and my neighbors and friends. And so it's a different love. It's a different responsibility that comes with parenting. But you don't have to wait till you get married to love deeply.
Yeah.
So I just throw that out for those who understand it. It's part. I think the temple covenants help us to love at a deeper level because we understand the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I tell my students, love is not a finite resource.
Yeah.
You're not going to run out of love.
Right.
As you bring more and more people, and you realize that your family a lot of times becomes more than just the children that are born to you or that you adopt. They can become the kids of the neighborhood and the people in your ward and your students. That your capacity to love is always replenished, and it's a reservoir that never really runs out, that just grows.
Yeah, and your parents and your aunts and uncles. And, I think especially in terms of a single individual, there has been so much, not just in our church, but in leadership, in Christianity in general. There's actually a great author, Ann Browdy. She's at Harvard. She talks about the role of single women and how much they do for churches and families. And there's a huge capacity for women. And I don't mean just single. I mean in any woman, but single, married, divorced, widow, whatever it is, that reality. And I love how you just say that love is infinite in its capacity. We perhaps are not there, but the more we become like Christ, the more infinite our capacity becomes.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of Religious Education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, Ryan Sharp, and Hank Smith. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU student Mitchell Bashford. Say hi, Mitchell.
Hey, guys.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.